Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Michaud, and I have the privilege of being the director of the School of Legal Studies. And I'd like to welcome you all here today as part of the Distinguished Lecture Series. Today, we're very pleased to have Dr. Tess Gerritsen, internationally selling author, great friend of Husson University, strong supporter of the School of Legal Studies, and just a really, really nice person. I met Dr. Gerritsen 17 years ago in the Camden Bagel Cafe. On a very cold night, she was signing autographs behind a little table, and her mother was there with her. I'm rereading the book now, and the front piece says, "It was really nice meeting you, John." We've continued to meet and greet each other occasionally throughout the years. She's spoken here many times before. She's visited with my student body many times. She actually involved my student body in doing some research for one of her novels, and she mentioned them in the acknowledgments of her novel. I'm rereading Bone Garden right now, which was the novel that she was signing at the Bagel Cafe. I don't want to spend too much time talking about her. What I do want you to understand is that she is a delightful, giving person. If you were at the graduation where she was a graduation speaker, I think you would agree with me, it's the finest graduation speech I've ever heard. So ladies and gentlemen, with no further ado, Dr. Tess Gerritsen.
Well, I almost feel like I'm back at home again. I've been here several times, and it feels very comfortable. And of course, John is one of my oldest friends. Now, I found out that I'm talking for the College of Business. Is that all right? Okay. Well, then I think I will talk a little bit about the so-called business of what I do. Because writing is a business, publishing is a business. It's a strange business, though, because it's made up of people who are creators who just make things up. You know, we don't invent anything except for fiction. And I'll go back into where that comes from. How do books get written, and how do books get made, and how do books get sold today? Because it's changed a lot since I first came into the business as a writer. So I started as a writer back when I was still working as a medical doctor. I came at it from an unusual position. I knew I wanted to be a writer when I was a child. My father said that was no way to make a living, so I became a doctor instead. But I never lost that desire to tell stories. And finally, when I was on maternity leave with my first child, I wrote my first book. And it sounds crazy that you can do that on maternity leave, but I had a son who slept hours and hours, and thank heavens, I like to tell him that I owe my writing career partly to his great sleeping habits. So one thing I have learned over these years, and I've been writing now for about 40 years, I've just turned in my 33rd novel, I can impart some wisdom about the process of writing. Number one is it never gets easier. It still is hard for me every time I sit down to write a book and I think, how did I do this the last time? I don't remember. So it's one of those things that it's not a straightforward kind of an occupation. It's something that sometimes takes you into circles. I've also found out that there's no easy genre to write. I started off writing romance novels, and then I wrote medical thrillers, and then I've written crime novels. Now I'm writing spy novels. I have done historicals. I have done science fiction. They're all difficult. So I never turn up my nose at a romance author, for instance, even those who write for Harlequin books, which I used to do. I've also learned that there's no wrong way to write a story, that every writer has their own technique. And you go to a writing course and you think, I'm going to learn how to write a book. Well, what they should teach you is that any way you do it is the right way. I know writers who they plot everything out ahead of time, especially the male attorneys who write novels. They're the ones who seem to have all their outlines set up. They have their ducks lined in a row, and so when they sit down to write a chapter, they know what's going to happen in that chapter. Then there are the rest of us, We call ourselves the seat of the pants writers, and I'm one of them. I sit down, I don't know what's going to happen that day in that chapter, and I find out as I write. So that's okay. It's okay to write a book that way as well. Now, for those of you who have a book in you or have a novel in you somewhere, you may be interested in where ideas come from. And let me tell you, the ideas are all around us. I can usually tell the moment one of my books is born. And by I mean born, I mean actually the idea just comes to my head and I think that is going to be a book. What I have learned is that the best ideas involve experience and emotion. It is something that hits you, the idea hits you and you think, oh my gosh, what happens next? Or this really bothers me, this needs to be a story. The first time I learned that particular lesson, I was having a conversation, I probably heard this story before, with a homicide detective. He told me that children were disappearing from the streets of Moscow, and they were convinced these kids were being kidnapped, sent to the Middle East, and sacrificed as organ donors for rich patients. I was very upset by that. That was an immediate emotional reaction because I have kids who are about the right age at that point to be organ donors. And I couldn't stop thinking about that. And it was 2 weeks later, I was still thinking about that. And I knew then that that was going to be my next book. But since I was writing romance novels, it was obviously not going to be a romance. And I wrote it anyway, and it was the first time I hit the bestseller list. And I'm convinced it was because of that emotional impact of that particular story. So when I am listening for stories or looking for stories or just waiting for a story to hit me, I'm always paying attention to my emotional reaction to what I hear. One example is, I've used this example before because I usually get a kick, the audience usually reacts the same way I did. I like to read a lot of newspapers. And one of the articles I had read was in the Boston Globe. It was from the suburbs. The story was about a young woman who was found dead in her bathtub. There were empty pill bottles. It was clearly an accidental overdose. And the police came. They didn't see a crime. They zipped her into a body bag, and they wheeled her to the morgue. And a couple of hours later, when she was in the morgue, she woke up in the body bag. And I read that, and I thought, oh, my God. I mean, didn't you all have that same reaction? Oh, my God. Because you're all imagining what it's like to wake up in a morgue. And I thought, how often does that happen? And I began to do a search on LexisNexis, and I found way too many cases of it. And if you take that story, person wakes up in a body bag, you can go in many different directions. You can, if you are writing horror novels, you can say that's a zombie, or that's a vampire who's woken up. If you write for Jason Bourne novels, you might say that's Jason, he faked his death, and that's how he's going to escape. But since I write thrillers, I use that in a book called Vanish, in which my medical examiner, Dr. Maura Isles, is working late one night in the morgue. She hears a noise. She opens up a body bag, and the corpse's eyes pop open. She sends that corpse to the emergency room, calls 911, and there the body who's woken up, grabs a security guard, kills him, and kills him with his own weapon, and takes hostages, and it becomes a hostage crisis. But it all started because I read this article in the Boston Globe that I couldn't stop thinking about. Again, that emotional reaction is what really launches a book forward for me. Now, I have this formula. There is a formula I use. I call it 2 + 2 = 5. And what I mean by that is sometimes you take an idea from here and you take an idea from there and you put them together and you get something even better. It becomes like a nuclear fusion thing where you're just melding two elements and becomes something very powerful. An example I use from that I have from my own past is, I collect articles all the time. I have this folder. I actually have it labeled my ideas folder. And I'd torn out this article from the newspaper, and the title of the article was Dugway Sheep Incident Declassified. Well, I thought, what the heck is this? I don't know how many of you are aware of what this Dugway sheep incident is, but it is something that happened in a real place called Skull Valley, Utah. It was years ago, It was a cold March night. A farmer who was living in Skull Valley was not feeling well, so he went to bed early. And he woke up the next morning, walked out, and in his front yard, it was covered with dead rodents and dead birds. Well, over that day, as the farmers drove out to look at their sheep, they found them all dead. 3,000 sheep died overnight in this one little valley. Nobody knew what had happened. The veterinarians came in, they couldn't figure it out. It was a mystery for 30 years until this article came out, and as I said, it was declassified, which gives you an idea of what had really happened. It turned out there was something called Dugway Proving Grounds nearby. It was a military base, and they were doing tests on nerve gas. Well, they had released this nerve gas. The wind took it in an unexpected direction, went into this valley, and killed all these animals. I read that, and the first thing I think of as a writer is, oh my gosh, what if it had not been a cold night? What if it had been a summer night and everybody had their windows open that night? How many people would have died in Skull Valley? And that was my idea for a book, but I didn't know what to do with it yet. I couldn't quite figure out how I would personalize it to my two series characters that I was working with at the time, Detective Jane Rizzoli and Dr. Maura Isles. So I put that away in my folder, and it sat there for about 10 years. I didn't know what to do with this idea until I had what I call a GPS incident. Probably most of us had before GPS got so good. I was traveling to a bed and breakfast in upstate New York, and my GPS took me into a cornfield. And I finally got to the B&B, and I mentioned to the person checking me in, oh my gosh, I got lost, my GPS took me in the wrong direction, and he said, oh, did you end up in the cornfield too? So I found out that there was a glitch, Google had a little glitch there, and that GPS incident was the +2 that I needed. I put those two together, and it became a story about my medical examiner, Maura Isles, who was in a medical conference in Wyoming. It's cold, it's winter. She decides to go with a friend on a skiing trip, and they use their GPS to get to the ski resort, and it takes them up a seasonal road. And as they are on the seasonal road, there's a snowstorm. The road is closed. They go off the road. Their Jeep gets stuck in the snow, and they're stranded. And there's nobody who's coming to rescue them because it is a seasonal road. So they have to hike into the nearest little town, and they get to this little village where there are about a dozen houses, and they find nobody there, but they do find that on all the dinner tables, dinner is waiting with food. There are cars in the garage, but there are no people, but there are dead pets. What happened? And that became a book called Ice Cold, which it was, again, a combination between the Dugway sheep incident and my GPS incident. So sometimes when you're looking for ideas, what you find out is that you have half an idea. You just have to find the other half, and it becomes a whole story. Sometimes I use my own interest, my own hobbies, and I hate to say this is a hobby, but I'm really interested in Egyptian mummies. I was an anthropology major in college, and I was really interested in Egyptology and Egyptian mummies. And over the years, I'd been corresponding with an Egyptologist who called me up one day, and he said, we are about to do a CT scan on a mummy in Poughkeepsie. Do you want to come and watch? Well, of course. I drove down to Poughkeepsie, and by the way, if you're curious about CT scanning of mummies, the CT scans that are used on mummies tend to be the same ones that scan us. They're in hospitals. And I also found out that there are about 400 to 500 Egyptian mummies in this country. How did they get here? Well, some of them came over with museums, but during the Victorian era, a lot of mummies came over with the tourist trade. You know, if you were a rich tourist and you went to Egypt and you wanted to bring home a souvenir, sometimes you'd bring home a mummy. They were $15 back then. And it would cost more to transport them back to the US. And they would sometimes end up in the weirdest places. There was a mummy that ended up in Wiscasset, in an antique store. I remember there was a newspaper article about who is this mummy and how did it end up in Wiscasset. The most interesting story about where a mummy came from was it ended up in Ripley's Believe It or Not in Niagara Falls. And nobody knew the history of this mummy until some Egyptologists noticed that this mummy had been posed in a royal pose. And he said, this is a very important mummy, we should look into it. And they found out it was the father of King Ramses the Great. Now, imagine that you are the most powerful man on earth, you are Pharaoh, and where do you end up? In Niagara Falls. So he was returned to Egypt with all honors. But anyway, so I was going to go watch the CAT scanning of a mummy. Nobody knew who this mummy was. We just knew that it had been in this museum in Poughkeepsie. I helped them load the mummy into the van. We drove it to the local hospital. And as we're waiting for this mummy to be scanned, I heard the conversation with the doctors and the radiology techs, and they said that it had taken months to arrange this CAT scan. The doctors wanted to do it, the museum wanted to do it. What was stopping it? It was the hospital attorney. The lawyer said because of HIPAA rules, we have to worry about patient confidentiality, and this patient cannot sign the consent form. So they got around that by having the museum be the parents. They signed the consent form. And as they're loading the mummy up into this CAT scan to get scanned, they had to fulfill patient information, right? So how old is the mummy? The museum said 2,000 years. Well, the CAT scan wouldn't take that, so they made it a day old. And the gender was also a question, and because there are 3 categories of gender for a CAT scan. It's male, female, and other. They put in other because nobody had ever done that in that hospital before. So we're watching the CAT scan of the mummy, and we're seeing, it's an X-ray, right? It's a 3D X-ray cross-section of the body, but with mummies, they do it from head to toe. And as we're watching the CAT scan of this mummy, you could see that the brain had been removed. You could see that a lot of the organs had been removed. And we got down to the thigh bone, and we realized that there was a fracture of the femur, and there was no sign of healing. So the theory was that this person, it was a man, had broken his thigh bone just before, around the time he died, and maybe that was the cause of death. But the writer is thinking a different way. And this is, those of you who are budding novelists, you probably have the same, and I know you people in the criminal justice department probably think the same way. You're thinking, what's the weirdest thing that could happen? Or what is there here that we cannot explain? And I was thinking, what if buried deep in the muscle of this 2,000-year-old mummy, we see something on CAT scan nobody expects? What if we see a bullet? Well, that's not a 2,000-year-old mummy, is it? And that became a novel called The Keepsake, about a killer who likes to mummify his victims. And lest you think that I was so creative coming up with this particular murder, I wasn't, because my Egyptologist friend told me it had been done in real life. He was called to India to consult on a mummy that was about to be sold to a museum by a private party. The museum was troubled by what they saw in this mummy, and they said, can you please come and examine it? So he flew out there, he looked at the CAT scan, he said, there's something really wrong about this mummy. First of all, it was a young woman, and what he saw was that the teeth had been pulled. He said the ancient Egyptians would never pull the teeth because you need them in the afterlife. So he said, why would you pull a young woman's teeth? It's because she had modern dental work. She was a modern homicide case. They had tried to sell her as a mummified Egyptian mummy, and they were caught, and it did go become a homicide investigation. So, I thought I was being very creative. There was a killer somewhere who'd gotten the idea before me. So those are just examples of things that, they surprise you, they excite you, they give you some emotional reaction, and then sometimes I get stories because of voices who talk to me. And I'm not saying, real voices, I'm talking about fictional voices that just, they get into my head and I think, I want to know the rest of your story. Well, this all started because I noticed something funny about my neighbors. Now, I've been living in Maine for 35 years, and I live in the mid-coast. And when we first moved to Maine 35 years ago, my husband, who was a medical doctor, opened up a private practice. And he would get occupational histories of his patients. And he would often hear this answer: "I used to work for the government." And he'd say, "What did you do for the government?" They'd say, "I can't talk about it." Well, when he heard that about the third time, he wondered, who are these people? And it was a real estate agent who told us they were all retired CIA. There may be one or two of you, maybe more, in this room right now, but we found out that retired CIA, there's a lot of you in Maine, particularly in the mid-coast. I found out that on my short street that I was living on, John, it was Pleasant Ridge Road, I had a retired OSS person on one side, and I had a retired CIA on the other. My son, who had a good friend, he was going to a sleepover, I called up the friend's father to make sure everything was fine, and the father said something that made me laugh, and I said, "Oh, you must be one of those retired spies." And there was a long silence on the phone, and he said, "Who have you been talking to?" And I discovered later that he and his wife were retired CIA. It turns out that there are quite a few couples who were retired CIA. Our library director in the town of Camden, Maine, she was CIA. And I have heard rumors that her daughter is too. We have a couple of restaurants in the mid-coast that were run by retired CIAs. There was a bed and breakfast that was formerly owned by somebody who retired from the intelligence agency. So why are they there? That was a question that I ask a lot of people, and I get, half a dozen different answers. One of them is that it's quiet and they won't find you there. Another is that it's far from any nuclear targets. I've heard that it's because it was a place to send people when you needed a safe house to get somebody to disappear for a while. There was a journalist named John Marcus who wrote for Yankee Magazine. If you can go back a year ago and look at the November issue of Yankee Magazine, the title of the article is "The Spies of Camden, Maine." And Mr. Marcus said that he first noticed this when he was looking at the obituaries in the Washington, D.C. newspapers. He noticed that people who said they were, these deceased people were with the CIA, a lot of them died in Camden, Maine. And he wanted to know, why are they all going up there and dying? So he came up to Camden, Maine to do his interviews. He said nobody would talk to him. And he finally changed the title or the focus of the article to "Why Would Spies Retire in Camden, Maine?" And one of the things he discovered that I didn't think about was that a lot of the original CIA people, before it was turned into CIA from OSS, a lot of them came from blue-collar background. I mean, from white-collar backgrounds. They were Boston Brahmins. They came from good families, and they probably spent their summers on Penobscot Bay as children. Their families had sailboats. They had planes, so they enjoyed living on the coast of Maine, and then they were recruited to the CIA, and after they finished, they just came back to where they had enjoyed their boyhood. That was just like this practical thing. There was also a newspaper article, where somebody said she'd been talking to CIA, her friends, and they said there are 3 types of CIA retirees, depending on quality. The bottom of the barrel retired in Bethesda, Maryland. Those that were kind of middling spies ended up in Florida, but the cream of the crop ended up in Maine. So if you're here, you are the cream of the crop. So I got that idea, and I was thinking about this. So like I told you, I've known about this for over 30 years, but I didn't know what the story was. I didn't know where that would go. I was interested in the fact that there are retired spies here. What happened was that I got old. As I got older, I noticed something. I notice women in particular, when our hair turns gray, we get ignored. Nobody pays attention to us anymore. They think less of us. We disappear, we become invisible. And that caused me to look at my neighbors differently, because I had heard about these retired CIA people, and I thought, oh, look at that nice gray-haired lady in the post office. Did you used to carry a gun? Or I'd look at this this nice guy shopping for stuff in the hardware store, and then maybe he's bald and he's getting into his 80s, and I would think, well, did you used to be dangerous? So you look at older people now with new eyes, and you think, yeah, they had full lives, and maybe those lives were pretty scary, and maybe they did heroic things. What would it be like if now they're in a little town in Maine, nobody looks twice at them, everybody thinks they're just like, grandma, but they have a past that it's about to come back to haunt them, and they have to strap on their guns again. I mean, I love the idea of a 70-year-old putting on that gun again. So that's how I ended up writing a book called The Spy Coast. But again, let's get back to the voice. It was because the voice of a woman said to me, I'm not the woman I used to be. And I thought, who did you used to be? And that became the story. Who did you used to be, Maggie Bird? So the story focuses on one woman who's now a chicken farmer in Maine. Everybody just thinks that's all she does. She raises chickens until a dead body shows up in her driveway. And the local police show up, and they noticed, first of all, that the woman who owns this house is kind of on the older side, and she's going to be very upset. Poor old Granny, she's probably really scared, but Granny's cold as ice. And then they notice that there are cameras mounted on her property, and they want to see her security system, and they're shocked to find out she has a 12-channel security system, and she's a chicken farmer. And that's where the other part of the story comes in. It's that conflict between young and old. Now, a lot of your kids are just young. You don't even look, you probably think, oh, he's retired. What can he possibly know? What can he possibly teach us? And that's what this police chief thinks. She's a young woman, she's in her 30s, and she doesn't realize that when she runs up against these retired spies, they are always going to be a step ahead of her. They are always going to be at crime scenes before she reaches them, and she doesn't know why. And it's that conflict between young and old that I wanted to focus on. So after that book came out, I thought, well, that was fun. But then I came across another little piece of CIA lore, which ended up being interesting as well. One thing I've learned about writers is that we read a lot, we ask a lot of questions, and we're very curious about a wide variety of topics because you just never know when something will turn into a story. So this topic became a story because I was reading about something called MK Ultra. Some of you probably know what MK Ultra is. It was a CIA program that was in the 50s to the 70s. I believe Hollywood has popularized it, made a couple movies about MK Ultra, but it was a mind control program. It was inspired because the Russians at that time had their own mind control program going on. They were trying to find drugs that would be useful for interrogation, drugs that might enhance your ability with ESP. They were actually believed then that ESP could allow you to spy remotely. So CIA found out about it and thought, well, we need our own mind control program, so they started MK Ultra. It involved giving things like LSD to people and watching for the reaction. It was happening around the world, in the United States, and the CIA had multiple places where they were giving drugs. One of them was San Francisco, and I laugh about the San Francisco one because they engaged prostitutes. The CIA was operating a house of prostitution in San Francisco, and they were giving these drugs to the clients with the help of the prostitutes. And they would give the drugs to the clients. They would see what their reaction is, and they figured that the clients would never complain. They wouldn't go home and tell their wives. So that was kind of a safe place to do it. And the humorous part was the name of the project in San Francisco was called Operation Midnight Climax. So that was the humorous part of MK Ultra, but there was a sad part as well. They were giving drugs to people in a mental institution in Canada. They probably made their conditions much, much worse. They gave LSD to one of their own colleagues without his knowledge, and he jumped out of an 11th floor window and died in the midst of an LSD psychotic break. So there was at least one death. It came to the knowledge of Congress. There were congressional hearings, and that's part of the reason it finally was shut down. As a result of the congressional hearings, the director of the CIA destroyed all the records. So we don't really know everything that went wrong with MKUltra, but as a writer, when you hear all records were destroyed, that's a green light, right? I can write about anything I want to, and there's no way to disprove what I'm saying. Now, I do know that there was a small little branch of MKUltra operating in Mid-Coast, Maine. I believe they were giving mainly magic mushrooms. It wasn't a big deal, but I can tell you which house it was happening in, and that brought it to Maine. That made a story that could be viable for my spies to be investigating. So that turned into a book as well. But these are just examples of how you pay attention to what moves you, to the things you read, to the conversations you have, and you just never know where that story is going to go. John asked me to tell a story about my mother, and I will tell you that that's a very personal story that turned into, in a way, a book. My mom was an immigrant from China. She passed away a number of years ago. But one thing about her childhood, and listen to your parents' stories, because your parents sometimes have the best stories. She was growing up in China. She was there during when the Japanese were invading China, bombing her hometown. And she saw ghosts. Everywhere she looked as a child, she said there were ghosts in the landscape. She remembers very clearly the kids were evacuating. They were sent out to a monastery, a nunnery in the countryside outside Kunming, and she remembers seeing a lady in white sobbing in the courtyard. And when she went out to talk to her, the woman vanished before her eyes. She saw ghosts outside her family window once, went outside. There was no evidence that he was there. And when she came to the U.S., I said, well, why don't I ever see ghosts? And she goes, because the U.S. is too young. You have to be an older country to generate ghosts, apparently. That turned into a book that I wrote called The Silent Girl, about Chinese history, about Chinese lore. So you never know what your parents are going to tell you that will become important. And in the end, there's one last story that I just want to tell. When my mother died, her last request was to be buried in China. Now, I thought, how do I do this? So she was cremated, and I had to get her back to China. But I didn't want TSA to take her ashes from me, so we put her in checked luggage. I put her in my suitcase. I checked the luggage, and I just hoped it would show up on the other end, and it did. We got to Kunming, and we were going to put her in a Buddhist monastery, and the family was there. I have family members in China that I had never met before, including my mother's nieces. So they met us in Kunming. They took us to the monastery, and we went to, and there was a lot that I didn't understand because I don't speak Mandarin. It's my fault. It's my fault that I never learned. But my son does. My American-born, half-Dutch son speaks Mandarin, which is amazing. So he was my interpreter for most of the way. And the stories that came out of that one particular trip, first of all, there were a lot of customs, local customs that I did not understand, that made no sense to me. One of them was, before she could be interred, we had to carry her ashes up the hill to where her parents were buried. And it had to be done under an umbrella, because you cannot allow the ashes to be seen by sunlight. So we walked all the way up the hill with an umbrella, and then we got there, and then we put her ashes on her parents' gravestone, and we sat there for 2 hours because they were supposed to have a conversation. And the conversation was between my late mother and her late parents. And in the meantime, of course, we brought food because they had to eat. And I remember I was very upset that my cousin lit a cigarette and put it on my mother's ashes. And I said, what are you doing? She goes, well, you don't know this, but whenever she came to visit China, she smoked. And my thought was, but it's so bad for her. What are you doing? So, and then after that, we went back to the Buddhist monastery where there was a ceremony. and she was interred in a special niche. And my cousin said, we chose this niche because it was above her classmate that she never liked. I said, why? And she goes, for once, she's on top. So she ended up on top of her unlikable classmate, which would have made her happy in the afterlife. And the final thing that happened was, as we were leaving, there's a locked gate, and when you walk through the gate, you have to turn and say to the deceased, goodbye, I'm leaving now. You have to say that. And if you don't say that, they will follow you, and they will wreak havoc in your life. So all of us, we got to the gate, we all had to say, goodbye, I'm leaving now, and then we left. So all those things, all those strange stories came back to me when I went home, and it became an article in the Wall Street Journal about bringing my mother back to China. So, when these things happen to you, pay attention to them. Pay attention to your emotions, because all these stories are all around us, and they're just waiting for you to tell them. I would like to take questions if anybody has any. If you ask a question, I'll probably come up with more stories.
If you have a question, just raise your hand.
If you don't have any questions, I will tell you a little bit of news. The Spy Coast is in development with Amazon Studios for television series. I spoke to the showrunner last week, and they have filled their writers' room. They have, I think it's like half a dozen writers who are contracted to write the first season, which is good. I mean, it wouldn't be going forward if Amazon wasn't paying money for these writers. And I heard the really big news is that they had hired their accountant, which was important. And she said they're reaching out to talent now. I don't know. Well, they gave me a couple names. I can't talk about them right now, that they're number one choices. But from what I understand, Maggie Bird, who is my retired spy, will be played by two different actors. One is Maggie as she is now in her 60s, and Maggie as she was in her 30s. So we'll have parallel stories going on. I don't know if it will be filmed in Maine. Probably not, because almost nothing is filmed in Maine these days. It's all filmed in Canada. But that's the latest on that television series. And I'm hoping, we'll get news about the talent soon.
Questions, raise your hand. Yeah.
What question?
Hello? Okay. It's more of a comment, but I heard you speak several years ago in Bangor, and something you said just has stuck with me. And it was about, I can't remember the character's name. He was very evil, but you talked about the fact that he became a part of your life, and you and your husband would sit around and talk about him. I thought, does that happen often? I mean,
that's an example of when a character talks to you and they get in your head, and they don't really exist, but they do become a part of you. Just like Maggie Bird and her spy friends became a part. I mean, I hear them talking in my head. So that particular character was from The Surgeon. I wrote this book about a serial killer who does horrible things, and he's by the time I finished writing The Surgeon, he does not die in that book. That's not a spoiler. He does not die in that book. He's still alive. And he was still in my head. But he was so vivid that my husband and I would discuss him sometimes at dinner, or we'd watch a television show with a horrible, horrible person. And my husband would say, oh, Warren could have done that. Or we'd read about some terrible crime, and we'd think, Warren might have done that. It got to the point where we were traveling in Italy, and we passed this sign for a torture museum in San Gimignano, and my husband said, you know who wants to go there, don't you? So it was as if Warren, this character, was sitting in the back seat asking to go to the torture museum. So we did go, and we got back, and at that point I was thinking about what the next book was to write. And I called up my editor and I said, I know you're expecting a book about this, but Warren wants another book. And she said, great, that's what we're hoping for. And that's really why The Surgeon became the first of a series. It's because Warren carried me over into book number 2. I wanted to find out what happened, what he did next. That's really a gift if you are a writer when a character starts talking to you, because that's half the battle. If they talk to you, you know a lot about them. You know a lot about their character. If I hear a voice, for instance, when I heard Maggie Bird's voice, you know, first of all, what the gender is. You know how old they are, because older people have a different timbre in their voice. You know how educated they are based on their vocabulary. But most important of all, you hear emotion in their voice. And with Maggie's voice, I heard regret and sorrow. And when she's saying, "I'm not the woman I used to be," it immediately launched the story for me, because I knew something terrible had happened to her, and that's why she left the CIA. And that became the whole point of the Spy Coast. So, yeah, and it's very true. I mean, and I hear other writers who say that once they hear a character's voice, it really gets, it's like, the jumping off point for a lot of stories.
Thank you. So I am someone who writes a lot of short form stuff. I'm a journalism student, but I've always been really interested in writing more long form content like a book. Could you tell me a little bit about kind of what your process is for concepting and bringing it all together?
Yeah, okay, long form. First of all, it involves a lot of sitting. I mean, when you do short form, yeah, it feels really good when, after a couple of weeks you finish this piece. But writing a novel, it takes stick-to-itiveness is all I can say. My process is that I have the idea, I have that initial emotion about what is the launch, of the story, and my process is weird in that I write my first drafts with pen and paper. I'm a really good typist. Okay, I can type 100 words a minute, but if I see my words on a screen, I want them to be perfect, and that stops me, because the editor takes over. You want to get rid of that internal editor. You just want to let your characters talk. So give yourself permission to write badly the first draft, even if that first draft is 400 pages. It can be a really bad first draft. That's fine. And that's where the editing process comes in. So I write the whole first draft with pen and paper. It takes me about 6-7 months for that first draft, and then I type it in myself. And then I go back, and the editorial process for me is it logical? Does everything, are there any dull points? Or do these characters do what I expect them to do, or what you would expect them to do? Are there enough surprises? And a lot of that, I don't think it's taught. I think it's something that you instinctively have, by having grown up watching a lot of movies and reading a lot of books, and you get to absorb what I call the dramatic, the sense of the dramatic. Not everybody has that. And I always go back to this illustration of, I have these beloved relatives. They passed away now, but one of them I'll just call Uncle Harry, and his wife is Aunt Maud. Okay? They're lovely people, and they can have an accident, and then they come into the kitchen, and Uncle Harry will tell you all about the accident. He'll be very dry. He'll, point by point by point, and it is so boring. And then his wife can sit down and she will tell you the same story, same characters, and you can't stop listening. What's the difference? The plot is the same, the characters are the same. It has something to do with the sense of the dramatic and how you tell that story. I don't know how to teach that. I know that some people are just born with that ability. So that's not really much advice, is it? Except have a sense of the dramatic and know it. And I can tell you what some of the mistakes are that I see a lot. Number one mistake is too much information at the beginning, what we call the data dump or the info dump, where you as a beginning author think, oh, I want you to know everything there is to know about Jane Doe. And so I find out what she ate for breakfast, and that her mother died when she was 5, and that she had a dog. And I learned that in the first 3 chapters. I don't need to know all that stuff. Those things are best conveyed in the moment when they become important. So no data dumps, no biographical dumps. I know some writing instructors will say, well, you should write a biographical sketch of your your character. And I never do that because I want to know who they are during the process of writing the book. I find out who they are as I'm creating them. I think that if you know too much about them ahead of time, it's boring. It's like reading a college entrance exam or a college entrance essay. And finally, this is something my agent says. She says, a big flaw she sees in book manuscripts is too much throat clearing. And what she means by that is it takes you 3 chapters to get to the conflict. There's a introductory throat clearing before you get to the real meat of the story. So, try and get to the tension immediately. And also I try to end every chapter with either a surprise or a question or something that leaves you ill at ease. I call it, just micro tension. It doesn't have to be a big deal, but it has to be something that makes you think, oh, that doesn't make sense. What happens next? If you watch enough television, not episodic TV, but long-form television where it's a one season and it's dealing with one story, you'll see that screenwriters, they just put that in there. That episodic tension, the end of the episode, they leave something there where you will just want to watch the next episode. Same thing with book chapters.
I have a question. Have you met Stephen King, and what are you reading right now?
I have met Stephen King, and he's a brilliant guy. I know that before it became obvious what an artist he was, people thought, oh, he writes horror, schlock, etc. But if you really were to read right from the beginning, Carrie, for instance, you'll find out he was a master of character. And that is not always appreciated because it seems so easy, right? You read his books and you say, oh, this is really simple stuff. No, it's not. It's the way expert gymnasts make the uneven parallel bars look easy. It takes a lot of practice, it takes a lot of skill. So, number one, he's a brilliant guy. What am I reading right now? Actually, because I'm working on CIA stuff, I'm reading a lot of Central Intelligence stuff. I'm reading a book called The Mission. It is the history of the modern CIA and all the mistakes they made, all the things that they should have done better. The other thing I want, if you're interested in Central Intelligence, the other thing is I recommend, there are a number of great podcasts and YouTube channels. There is one in particular I love called And the Rest is Classified. That's the title of the YouTube channel. John, you may be interested in this. They discuss the difference between people who work for the FBI and people who work for the CIA. People who work for the FBI want to follow the law, right? They try to be law-abiding. They try to abide by the law. CIA is all about breaking laws, about getting around the laws. So as these two people say on their podcast, they're very, very different personalities. And I think you probably follow the rules, don't you?
Hypothetically, you're right.
I had a question too. You said you're also a criminal justice major up here too. Have you ever heard about this is also what applies to the CIA. There was a gentleman who came all the way from New York to have an affair with another woman, but claimed that if anything should ever happen to him, it was the CIA who took him out. And he faked his death to actually make it look like a homicide by the CIA and stumped the state Maine officials for about 2 to 3 months.
I don't know about this.
If you want any more information, I can get you to the guy who actually worked at the lead detective for it, and that could give you inspiration.
All right. I do want to caution you, though, that everybody who says he's CIA is probably not. The ones that I know of, they don't talk. They really don't. And that used to be the best pickup line in New York City, You go up to a girl in a bar and she says, what do you do? And they'll say, oh, I can't talk about it, but I'm CIA. And they never are. I was always warned that if somebody actually comes out and says they're CIA, they, steer clear.
Hi. I just had a question about when you were on maternity leave and you wrote that first book. that was not planned, right? You just sat down and started writing. How did you go about getting that book published? And
Okay.
Getting it in the right hands?
Yeah, here I am doing a business lecture. I didn't even talk about the publishing industry. I'm sorry. I did it this was a long time ago, so I did it the traditional way, which was I approached a literary agent. And my literary agent was the one who sold the first book. I should talk about literary agents, okay? The agent I work with now is my third agent. You have to be careful. I have had 3 agents. My first one I fired because he was stealing my royalties. So, the way it works is that publishers send your royalty check to your literary agent, they take their 15% cut, and then they send on the money to you. Well, this guy was not sending me any money. And 2 years later, I had to go to the publisher. I said, have there been any royalty checks? And they said, we've been sending them to you for 2 years. And I found out that they never got to me. So he got fired. My second literary agent retired because of poor health. This is an anecdote about how women do business, okay? So my second literary agent said, I'm retiring, but here's a list of agents that I recommend you approach. And I looked down that list of 12 names, and I chose one name in particular for the reason that her first name was Meg, and I've always liked that name. So here's Meg in New York City, and she's getting dozens of query letters, through the mail. This is back when everybody was doing things through the mail. And she pulls mine out of the pile of all the others, and she goes, ooh, I really like this stationery. That's how we ended up together. And it's been years later, and she's the best agent in the world. So, there is a certain amount of kismet in the whole industry. So your agent sells it to the publisher. The publisher will assign you an editor. The editor looks at your manuscript, makes suggestions for improvements. You finish all those. Then it goes to the copy editor who looks up grammar and factual stuff, and then it goes to the printer. But in the meantime, and this is probably one of the most important parts of publishing, somebody is designing the cover. And you'd be surprised how important that cover design is to book sales. Unless you have a great name, if you're unknown, it's your cover that's going to sell, your cover and your title that's going to sell the book. And I am lucky enough to be able to turn down covers I don't like. Not every author has that right. And then, so a year after you've turned it in, the book goes on sale. Now, over the years, the business of publishing has changed so drastically. There were no digital books when I started. And I was such a bad prognosticator. I remember when they first started selling ebooks, I said, oh, that'll never happen. Nobody's ever going to buy an ebook. We all want to buy real books. Well, my sales now are probably 75% digital. The print market is still there. Certainly overseas it's still there, but now, at least 50-50 is now digital, so that's changed. The bookseller industry has changed. Borders disappeared. What happened to Borders? Disappeared, right? Barnes & Noble looked like it was going to go under, but Barnes & Noble seems to be coming back. Independent bookstores seem to be coming back. And now the big concern we have, and this is something that Authors Guild is dealing with, is AI. I have a couple of friends who are writers who said asked AI, write a book in my style, and they were shocked. They said, a minute later a book comes back, and it's not bad. It's very close to their own writing. It turns out AI has been training off our stuff that they've been pulling off the internet. So I think the last AI, there was a lawsuit, Anthropic lawsuit. There's a settlement coming. And as an author, you can write your name in there and find out how many of your books were used by AI. 22 of my titles are on there. So if they were to say, write a book in the manner of Tess Gerritsen, another minute, there would be a new book out by me. So that's what everybody's worried about, especially authors. I'm not sure how long this profession is going to last because of artificial intelligence. Actors are already dealing with it now because they're making up fake actors. Thank you.
Tremendous as always. Dr. Gerritsen has agreed to sign books. The bookstore has some books for sale. She mentioned research. I would be remiss if I did not mention one of the first times she came here, she had written a book called Gravity, which I thought was an amazing book. I'm reading all of her books for the third time right now. We had a professor here by the name of Ken Lane, who worked for NASA, and he used to plot the NASA rocket shots. Gravity had a lot to do with that. I gave him the book. I don't know whether you remember this or not, but when she came to teach, he handed her the book back and said, I couldn't find a mistake. It's amazing. She'll be outside in the atrium in just a few minutes. Thanks again.
I want to add one little bit to that. I did get a call from a NASA engineer after Gravity came out, and he goes, I loved your book, but you made a mistake. And I said, what mistake was that? And he said, you had your character drive into the Building 30 parking lot and park his car. And I said, yeah. And he goes, I've worked here for 20 years. I've never found an empty space in that lot. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.